Hi guys, it's Just Honest Fiction and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be sharing my May wrap-up. Alright guys, so May was an amazing reading month for me. I read 22 books and most of the books I actually rated over 4 stars, which is fantastic. Now, similar to my other wrap-ups, I will be sorting this by genre, so if you're looking for a certain type of book, check the timestamps down below. And if you're unfamiliar with my channel, I post new videos every Thursday and Sunday. If you haven't yet, please like and subscribe. You can also hit that notification bell to be notified whenever I post new bookish content. You can also check out my Instagram and Goodreads, both linked down below. With all that out of the way, let's talk about the books I read in May. Alright, so starting off with fantasy, first up we have The Book of Night by Holly Black. So this is the Fairy Loot version, really pretty, and this is getting a lot of mixed reviews, and I kind of understand why. So Holly Black is really known for her Cruel Prince series, which is like a YA fantasy series that I absolutely hated. So this book feels completely different. Don't go into this thinking it's like the grown-up version of the Cruel Prince. This has like a completely different vibe. We're following Charlie, who used to be this burglar for people known as Glomus, I believe. There are these people that practice shadow magic, and they're actually able to project their shadow to like steal things or manipulate people or like cause harm. So Charlie's trying to steer away from that path. She's now working at a dive bar, living this very like, not boring life, but very just not exciting life with her long-term boyfriend. And then one day, something happens at the bar she's working at that kind of pulls her back into this world of shadow magic. And I really enjoyed this. I thought it was fun. I will say it is a very short adult fantasy book, so there's not too much world building. That's definitely something that I feel like could have been improved upon. And then also, there is a lot of info given to you in the very beginning, some of which I didn't feel was really necessary to the plot. But once you get about halfway in, the book really gets going, and it was a lot of fun. So I highly recommend, if you're a fan of like Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo, and you just like that dark, gritty vibe in your fantasy, I think you will really love this. Alright, so next up is a fantasy romance book that had been on my TBR for a very long time, but I recently saw a bunch of people reading it, so I wanted to try it out. It was an interesting time, and that is Feather. So this is an angel romance. It's new adult, and we're following Lay. And Lay is this angel who is trying to earn her last few feathers in order to complete her wings and ascend to the Elysium, which is kind of like this book's heaven. And in order to gain these feathers, Lay has to help out sinners on Earth. So one day she finds out that there's this really bad guy who's done a bunch of sins and he's worth like 100 feathers. So she goes down to Earth to help him. And this is Jared. He's the head of this mafia. And obviously these two end up falling in love and forming a relationship. So this is actually a Romeo and Juliet retelling, which I didn't know going in. And it was, I don't know. I don't know how I feel about it. So there were parts of it that I like. I also keep finding myself thinking about it since I finished it, but then there are parts that just read very like old school YA to me. If you're familiar with Twilight, angels, similar to Edward Cullen, sparkle. It was just an odd element to like throw in there. But overall, I'm not going to continue with the series. It just wasn't for me. However, I think if I read this like 3 years ago, I would have absolutely loved it. So definitely if you want like a fantasy romance that's a very quick read with a very interesting world, I would check this out. Just personally, it wasn't for me. Alright, so this next book I've actually talked about a lot on my channel, and that is Untainted by Lillian T. James. So this is following Vera, and when Vera was 5 years old, she was stolen and brought to this empire where she is pretending to be human, to the point that when she reaches 20 years old, she really doesn't remember anything about her past. That is until a Fae male ends up bumping into her and he decides he's gonna set her straight. This was really fun. So I've said in other videos, this book isn't doing anything super unique. However, it's just done very well. It is a Fae story, you have romance, you have action, and I just really enjoyed it. It's also very fast paced. You can definitely read this in like 1 or 2 sittings, and I cannot wait for the second book to come out. So highly recommend if you want just a good fantasy romance with a little bit of spice, check this out. Alright, and last up for fantasy, I read Fable. So I actually buddy read this with Issa from Fun Fantasy Books. I will leave her channel linked down in the description below. She does amazing fantasy content. So I ended up enjoying this book so much more than I thought I was going to. This book is so atmospheric. So it's a YA fantasy story, and it's about this girl, Fable. whose father is a very revered pirate captain, and he ends up leaving Fable on this island that's full of like burglars and miscreants, and he wants her to prove herself by getting off this island on her own. So Fable ends up learning how to dive and just like do all of these amazing things by herself, and she's able to get off this island, and when she does, she meets this group of people, and together they kind of form this like found family, and they end up going on this adventure where they're trying to find this sunken pirate ship, and it was so good. So like I said, this book, so atmospheric. I felt like I was on the water the entire time I was reading it. It is just written so beautifully. So I do plan on picking up the second book, Namesake, at some point during the summer, but overall, this was a very solid YA fantasy. All right, so moving on to the new releases that I read this month. First up, we have Every Summer After, and this is by Carley Fortune. So this is like the perfect summer read. We're following Persephone and Sam, and when Persephone was 13 years old, her family ends up getting this lake house, and across the street is Sam. They're the same age, and soon they become best friends, completely inseparable. And then something happens. So then we jump forward 12 years, and we find out that Sam and Persephone haven't spoken to each other, and they're completely estranged, and we're trying to discover what incident led to this. So this is jumping back and forth through time, so we're going every summer until the big event happened. And this was super emotional and really good. I will say I was really frustrated with Persephone when we find out exactly what caused their rift, but overall, super solid read, and like I said, perfect for summer. All right, so next up was a book that was on my most anticipated books of 2022, and that is Book Lovers by Emily Henry. So this is following Nora and Charlie. Nora is a literary agent. She's cutthroat. She has a very good reputation. And then we have Charlie, who is an editor, and these two absolutely hate each other. They do not like working together, and unfortunately, when Nora and her sister go on a vacation to this very small town, they run into Charlie, and then they end up Charlie ends up betting Nora that she's not going to be able to complete this list that she's created that's supposed to like let go of her inhibitions, and it goes from there. So I will say Beach Read is probably one of my top contemporary romance novels. It's so good. It's so emotional. It's just an amazing read. And then I also really enjoyed People We Meet on Vacation. This is probably my least favorite of the Emily Henry books I've read. However, it was still a very good read. The reason I wasn't a huge fan of it reminded me a lot of Gilmore Girls. So the way the characters in Gilmore Girls talk to each other, it's very intellectual, but it's also very fast-paced, and it just grates on my nerves. I actually hate Gilmore Girls, and the way these two characters interact is very similar to that. So I just didn't like the two main characters. However, I still think it's a very fun read. Still feels very much like an Emily Henry book, so if you enjoyed her other two books, I would pick this up. I just wish I enjoyed it a little bit more. And last up for new releases, I read Something Wilder by Christina Lauren. Unfortunately, this is probably going to be my lowest rated book on this list, but I feel like that has to do with my expectations going into the book. So I thought this was going to be similar to like Love in Other Words or In a Holidays, which are these rom-coms but still have like a lot of emotion. This was more like a treasure hunting adventure, but like throw in a little bit of romance. So we're following Lily, whose father is Duke, and he is a very famous like treasure hunter. And when the story starts, Lily is dating this guy, and they're about to take over the ranch, and Lily's father, Duke, is going to leave. So we find out that the guy Lily's dating actually ends up going back to New York, completely leaves her, and then Duke ends up selling the ranch that Lily absolutely loved. So then we jump into the future 10 years, and Lily is doing these treasure hunting adventures with like people from the city, and that's how she's making money, and she's trying to save up enough money to buy her ranch back. Well, one of these city people ends up being her ex-boyfriend that left her, and we kind of get to find out like what happened, and then we find out that her father, or Lily's father, Duke, might have actually left money and all of this treasure for Lily to find. So these people go on this adventure to try to find this treasure, and it was a time. It was very, I don't know, I think once again, had I gone into this expecting a like Western type thing, I would have enjoyed it more, but because I was expecting something very emotional and didn't get that, I rated it kind of low. But definitely I would check it out, just know what you're getting going in. All right, so next I read two books by Jennifer Hartmann. The first one is The Thorns Remain. This book, so I don't have a grasp on my feelings about this book. I even posted on my Instagram stories that I'm either loving this book or absolutely hating it, and I still feel similarly. So this is following Evan. It's from his point of view, and he has been cheated on, and he's getting a divorce, and he is just out for vengeance, and he doesn't care who he hurts along the way. So we're following a very flawed character, And I've never read a book where I hated almost every single person in the book except for maybe 2 people. Like, everyone in this book makes terrible, terrible life decisions. And it takes them a while to realize, like, what they're doing is hurting other people, like, besides themselves. So at the end, I actually, like, sent the Love Librarian, I'll leave her channel link down below, a, like, rant about these characters. It's a lot. So overall, I did enjoy it. It was good. I like the way everything was kind of figured out at the very end of the story. However, it's very frustrating watching these people do the things they do and then seeing what happens to the people around them. I'm a child of divorce, so that also probably affects the way I'm viewing these things. And so is my husband. So it was just, I don't know, it was just a very interesting read. So I would recommend it. It was good. It's just be ready to be infuriated while you're reading it. All right, and next up we have Lotus, and this is by Jennifer Hartmann. So this is the story of a young boy, Oliver, who ends up being kidnapped when he's 5 years old on the 4th of July. And then he reappears 22 years later, but he's been isolated for so long he really doesn't know how to act in society. Luckily, Sydney, who was Oliver's best friend before he was kidnapped, is ready to help heal him and just get him back out there. She never lost hope that Oliver was still out there, and it's their love story. We also kind of find out like what happened or what caused Oliver to be taken and what happened while he was in isolation, and this was just really fun. So I was not a huge fan of Still Beating. It was just a little too dark for me. This was like the perfect amount of suspense / trauma and also love story. So I highly recommend trying this out. This is definitely one of my favorite Jennifer Hartmann books. All right, so moving on, we have Tears of Tess. This is probably the darkest book on this list. So this is following a girl that when she goes on vacation with her boyfriend, she ends up being kidnapped and then trafficked. And she ends up being purchased by this guy that is known as being like one of the most evil like masters there is. And this definitely has some like BDSM non-con type stuff. He puts her in a lot of very uncomfortable situations, but also our main character seems very into this. It is established very early on in this book that our main character likes being subservient in the bedroom. So this very much blurs the line. I will say I probably won't be continuing with this series only because I really didn't love the romance. There were some very upsetting scenes towards the beginning of the book, not with the love interest, but with other traffickers. So definitely check trigger warnings. However, it wasn't as dark as I was expecting, but also not my favorite read of the month. All right, so the next few books are romantic suspense. I actually have a full romantic suspense video that I will leave in the cards in the description where I talk about a lot of these books, so I'm gonna do this very quickly. First up, we actually have Indigo Ridge. I don't own a physical copy. This is the first book in the Eden series by Devney Chase. So this is following our main character, Quincy, who's about to become the new chief of police in this very small town. Now, already there's a lot of things stacked against her. She's a woman, she's new to this town, and then she ends up having a one-night stand with Griffin on the first day, not realizing that he is the eldest son of a very prominent family in this town. So soon after that, on Quincy's like one of her first days on the job, there is a body found under Indigo Ridge, and the locals believe that these girls are just committing suicide and jumping from this ridge. However, Quincy thinks there might be something else at play, and then she ends up having a relationship with Griffin, and it goes from there. This was okay. So I did enjoy this. I did enjoy the second book, Juniper Hill, much more. I feel like this felt very much like a romance, and then we just threw a lot of suspense at the very end. I felt like it needed to have a little bit more like interwoven clues. I also didn't love who the perpetrator ended up being. I feel like they could have hinted at that a little bit more earlier in the book. But besides that, it was a solid read, and if you like romantic suspense, I would definitely check out this series. All right, and then next up we have Juniper Hill. This is the second book in the Eden series by Devney Perry. I think I said Devney Chase earlier. My bad, Devney Perry. But this book was so good. So we're following Memphis, who's the single mother who is fleeing New York City, and she ends up moving across country, and she ends up staying at Knox Eden's loft. So Knox Eden is the younger brother of Griffin from the first book. He is this tattooed, grumpy chef that's really good with babies, and he's everything. I love Knox Eden. He's like my favorite character so far in this series. So she ends up moving in with him. He doesn't want her living with him. However, his sister, or Knox's sister, is the one that like set up this living arrangement. So we kind of find out why Knox is so against having a woman with a baby staying with him. and then also why he's kind of grumpy. And then we also find out a lot about Memphis and why she fled New York City. And the story goes from there. But it was really good. I loved their relationship. This is very grumpy sunshine. And Knox is just everything. Like, tattooed guy cradling a baby is just chef's kiss. So can't recommend this one enough. Really, really good. Next up, we have Violent Lights, and this is by Jessica Hawkins. So this is the first book in the White Monarch series. I loved this series. It's so good. So this is Spanish Cartel. We're following Natalia, and when she is very young, she walks into her mother's bedroom and sees her mother lying on the floor, bleeding out, and Cristiano, her best friend Diego's older brother, standing over her mother's body. So Natalia immediately suspects Cristiano and blames him for her mother's murder. So Cristiano ends up fleeing, and then Natalia and Diego just grow up together. They're best friends. Soon it becomes a relationship, and Diego wants Natalia to run away with him. They're gonna flee the Spanish cartel and just live a life together. Now, Cristiano ends up returning when Natalia is like 20 years old and says that he is not actually the murderer of Natalia's mother. So this is like brothers both fighting after the same girl. I will say this first book is very much a setup book. However, it ends on quite a, I wouldn't say cliffhanger, but a very exciting moment. And then the rest of the series is just absolutely amazing. This is definitely a series that you're gonna wanna binge. It is so, so good. Next up is a Mafia romance, and it is Mafia Mistress and Mafia Darling. It's a duet by Mila Finelli. So this is following Fausto and Francesca. So Francesca is this 18-year-old girl. She's the daughter of the head of the Canadian Mafia, and she just wants to go off and live her life. She's about to go to college, and she just wants to be free of like the Mafia. Unfortunately, Fausto is the head of the Italian Mafia, and he is looking for a wife for his son. So Fausto ends up kidnapping Francesca and takes her to Italy. Now, when she gets there, the son of Fausto and Francesca end up just kind of being friends. We find out why that is a little bit later. So then Francesca ends up being Fausto's mistress. This was so good. So I really loved the spicy time in this. I love Francesca's personality. I love the way she goes up against Fausto. And then I loved Fausto. Like, he is just so controlling, but also like touch her and you die. It was just great. So this first book, really good. Mafia Darling, I picked up right away because this book ends on kind of a cliffhanger. And I didn't love how Fausto changed. He becomes a little bit more, not dismissive, but he's not nearly as strong of a character as he was in this book. So this book I would probably give like 4 out of 5. Mafia Darling, the second book, I would probably give like 3.5. But overall, very solid Mafia romance. Definitely check it out. All right, and then last up for romantic suspense, I read Be Still My Heart by Sav R. Miller and Emily McIntire. So this is following Sloane, and she is a detective that is being sent to Skelm Island, which is this very isolated, like creepy island in Maine, and all of these women are being found with these Latin inscribings in their stomach, so there's some sort of serial killer located on this island. So when Sloane gets there to try to solve the murders, she ends up meeting Lincoln right away, and Lincoln is like the town's golden boy. He's an ex-Navy SEAL, and right away, these two cannot stand each other. So this is enemies to lovers. And even though Lincoln and Sloane can't stand each other, they also have this connection where they keep getting like pulled into each other's path. So I will say, I almost DNF'd this when I first started. I messaged one of my friends who had already read it and was like, I'm pretty sure I know who the murderer is within the first like 10 chapters. And I was correct. However, there's like a second mystery that I did not see coming at the end of this book that was so good. I also love the way Salvador Miller and Emily McIntire write like the spicy scenes. They're really good. I really like enemies to lover spice. So overall, highly recommend picking this up if you want like a really good romantic suspense. Next up, I read 2 very emotional contemporary romances. The first one is Archer's Voice, and this is by Mia Sheridan. So this is following Bree, who after a very upsetting event takes place, she ends up moving to this beach town in Maine. It was the last place that Bree lived that she truly felt happy. And when she gets there, she soon becomes completely immersed in this town, gets to know everyone, except for the mysterious Archer, who is kind of like this nomad. No one in the town really speaks to him. He's really isolated, and Bree ends up making it her mission to get to know Archer. And it's their story, and it's so good. I can't believe it took me so long to pick this book up. I really enjoyed it, and I will definitely be reading more from this author. And next up, we have Full Tilt by Emma Scott. So this is following Casey and Jonah. Casey is this girl that just doesn't know what she's doing with her life. She's part of a rock band and she's just partying and getting blackout drunk like every day. Then you have Jonah, who keeps to this very rigid routine. We're not exactly sure why, but one of his jobs is a limo driver. So when he has to drive Casey home, he can't get her into her apartment, so he ends up taking her back to her place because she is blacked out drunk. And when she wakes up, they right away form a relationship and this connection. However, Jonah keeps trying to push Casey away, and Casey just isn't sure why. So this is their love story. This was so good, but also so freaking sad. So know that going into it. It is part of a duet. I am planning on reading the second book in June. It's going to be on my June TBR. But oh my goodness, you can just read this as a standalone and it's going to make you cry, but also so good. So highly recommend. All right, and last up, I read 2 historical romance books. I actually vlogged my experience trying out historical romance, so I will leave that vlog in the cards and in the description. So first up for Dark Historical, I read The Highwayman by Kerrigan Byrne. So this is following Dugan and Farah, these 2 young children that were raised in an orphanage together, and they were just best friends that eventually had this like cute little marriage ceremony. And that is until Farah ends up being sexually assaulted by one of the people that run the orphanage. So while protecting Farah or defending Farah, Dugan ends up killing the person that was attempting to assault her, and then he is sent away. So then Farah ends up growing up. She works for Scotland Yard, and then one day when she walks into work, she sees Dorian Blackwell, who is this very bad guy, and Dorian ends up kidnapping Farah and taking her to his estate, and it goes from there. So I really like this. I did say in the vlog it wasn't as dark as I was expecting. However, a lot of people have commented saying that as you go through and progress through the series, it actually gets darker. So I do plan on reading the second book, The Hunter, at some point in June. All right, and then last up, I read In Bed with the Devil by Lorraine Heath. So this is following Lucian, who was, when he was very poor, he ended up killing this man. And then that man's grandfather ends up recognizing Lucian, or thinks he recognizes Lucian, and says that he is actually his missing grandson, and Lucian ends up becoming an earl. Now, everyone in like noble society doesn't believe that Lucian is actually this missing child, and they treat him terribly. So he grows up kind of like with a chip on his shoulder. So then you have Catherine, who I love. She is this very strong female character whose father is kind of in almost like a catatonic state, so she has a lot of autonomy. She's able to do a lot that I feel like a lot of women weren't able to do during this time period. So her best friend's husband is assaulting her best friend. It's a whole domestic violence relationship. So Catherine ends up going to Lucian to ask that Lucian kill her best friend's husband. Now, in return, Lucian has a huge crush on this girl, Franny. However, she isn't very wealthy, so she doesn't know how to act in like noble society. So Lucian says, if you teach Franny how to act like a lady, then I will kill this guy for you. And it's their story, and it was really fun. Very much enjoyed it, so I do plan on also continuing with this. I believe it's called The Scoundrel of St. James series. All right, guys, so those are all the books I read in May. Please let me know down in the comments below if you have read any of these books. I said this already, but I post new videos every Thursday and Sunday, and if you haven't yet, please like and subscribe. I will see you all next week. Bye!